From New York, this is Democracy Now!
They were struck with such a slap last night. That's another matter.
Military
action like this is not sufficient. What is important is ending the corrupting presence of America in the region.
After warning Iraq, Iranian forces fired 22 missiles at a pair of military bases housing U.S. and Iraqi troops in Iraq in what Iran described as fierce revenge for the U.S. assassination of the Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani. There were no casualties reported. We'll get response from across the U.S. as well as Tehran, Iran. Then President Trump signs an emergency declaration for Puerto Rico after a 6.4 magnitude earthquake kills at least one person, sparks a massive power outage that plunged nearly the entire population into darkness. We'll go to San Juan for the latest.
Horrible, 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 horrible. Everything fell on top of us. We went out to the street, and getting there was an odyssey because everything had fallen on the road. It's really hard to see so many houses around you on the ground. It's not easy, but to the glory of God, we're alive.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Iranian forces fired 22 ballistic missiles at two Iraqi military bases that house U.S. and Iraqi troops early Wednesday morning in what Iran described as revenge for the U.S. assassination of the Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani at the Baghdad International Airport Friday. The missiles were launched from inside Iran. Iraq says Iran warned them ahead of the attacks, which struck the Al-Assad air base in the western province of Anbar and a base near Erbil in northern Iraq. Senior Iraqi officials say there were no U.S. or Iraqi casualties in the strikes. This is Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif speaking after the missile attacks.
Well, we've said very clearly that if the United States takes any further action, Iran will respond accordingly, and we will respond in a very harsh way, but proportionately. Well, we did not start this process of escalation. The United States waged an economic war against Iran. The United States has to come to its senses.
Only hours after the launch of the missiles, a Boeing 737 jet crashed shortly after takeoff from Tehran's international airport, headed to the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. The crash killed all 176 people on board, including 82 Iranians and 63 Canadians. Iranian media reported the crash was due to technical difficulties. The jet is a predecessor to Boeing's flawed 737 MAX passenger jet, which has been grounded worldwide following two deadly crashes that killed all 346 people on board. Meanwhile, in Iraq, anti-government protesters are calling for demonstrations on January 10th to demand an end to political interference by the United States or Iran in Iraqi politics. Iraqi journalists are also reporting armed men attacked anti-government protesters in the southern city of Nasiriyah, opening fire and burning down tents at their protest encampment. This all comes as the United States is deploying about 4,000 U.S. soldiers from the 82nd Airborne Division based out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to Kuwait. This is military spouse Katie Hernandez.
So the thought of my husband being on a plane to a war zone by the end of the day it's shocking, even to us. Even though it's his job, technically it's not the job that we're used to. So it is very sudden and unexpected and traumatic to the military families and the community here, because this is not something that we have seen, at least in the last 10 years or so.
We'll have more on the latest on the U.S., Iraq, and Iran after headlines. On Capitol Hill, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says he has enough votes from Senate Republicans to begin President Trump's impeachment trial without the support of Senate Democrats. McConnell's pushing to open the trial with only an initial agreement to hear arguments from the prosecution and defense, not a guarantee to hear witnesses. Democratic lawmakers are demanding McConnell and Senate Republicans agree to call witnesses in the Senate trial because some high-level witnesses called by the House during its impeachment process refused to comply with the congressional subpoenas to testify at the direction of the White House. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton now says he would comply with a subpoena to testify in the Senate trial if he's called to do so. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is continuing to withhold the articles of impeachment in efforts to pressure Senate Republicans to call witnesses, although there's speculation McConnell could try to open the trial without the articles. President Trump has signed an emergency declaration for Puerto Rico after a 6.4 magnitude earthquake killed at least one person and sparked a massive power outage that plunged nearly the entire Puerto Rican population into darkness Tuesday. It's the largest earthquake to hit Puerto Rico in more than 100 years and follows a series of strong quakes that have rattled the island in recent days. Flattened homes and inoperable power plants have left nearly 350 people homeless and at least 300,000 without drinking water. This is one Puerto Rico resident, Josefina Betancourt Pacheco.
Oh, please. Horrible, 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 horrible. Everything fell on top of us. We went out to the street, and getting there was an odyssey because everything had fallen on the road. It's really hard to see so many houses around you on the ground. It's not easy, but to the glory of God, we're alive.
We'll go to Puerto Rico later in the broadcast. In Spain, lawmakers are poised to form Spain's first progressive coalition government since the 30s after a narrow parliament vote Tuesday. The leader of Spain's Socialist Party, Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez, has agreed to form the coalition government with Pablo Iglesias, the head of the leftist Podemos party, and with smaller regional parties, including pro-independence lawmakers from Catalonia. The Nation magazine reports Spain's new coalition government has promised to strengthen job security and unions, raise the minimum wage, pass legislation to curb climate change, and introduce universal public child care. In Argentina, the leftist government of President Alberto Fernandez has withdrawn credentials for the ambassador of U.S.-backed opposition figure Juan Guaidó of Venezuela, reversing the stance of former right-wing President Mauricio Macri. Elisa Tratagamus was recognized as the legitimate ambassador of Venezuela by Macri last year, as Guaidó self-appointed himself president and attempted to overthrow the elected Venezuelan president Nicolás Maduro. In a two-sentence letter addressed to Tratagamus, the Fernandez government notified it was, quote, putting an end to your special mission in the Argentine Republic. In India, hundreds of thousands of unionized workers and students took to the streets today for a strike to demand a rise in the minimum wage and to protest the privatization of natural resources. Many students are also boycotting classes in solidarity with violent attacks on students at Delhi's Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, who blamed the attack on a right-wing student group linked to Prime Minister Narendra Modi's ruling BJP party. This is one of the protesters today, Rajbir Singh.
Today, the whole of India is observing a shutdown. All the banks of the country are shut. This is against the central federal government's privatization and anti-employee policies.
In Canada, Indigenous leaders issued an eviction notice to the workers of a pipeline company seeking to build a $6.6 billion gas pipeline through First Nations territory in British Columbia. In a press release, 5 clans of the Wet'suwet'en Nation said Coastal GasLink had violated the nation's trespassing law and, quote, has bulldozed through our territories, destroyed our archaeological sites, and occupied our land with industrial man camps. The ongoing criminalization of our laws by Canada's courts and industrial police is an attempt at genocide, they said. On Saturday, Coastal GasLink workers reportedly complied with the eviction notice and vacated the work sites, but Reuters reports construction of the pipeline resumed on Tuesday. In Delaware, a teenager reportedly threw an incendiary device at a Planned Parenthood building early Friday morning, sparking a fire at the clinic. Authorities have charged 18-year-old Samuel James Gulick with 3 criminal counts, including intentionally damaging a facility that provides reproductive health services. He faces up to 20 years in prison. And a New York Times analysis reveals there have been shootings at or around after-school sporting events nearly once a week across the country this academic year. The more than 20 shootings at football, basketball, and other games have largely gone overlooked in the discussion around the epidemic of school shootings in the United States. Among the victims this year was Micah Tennant, who was fatally shot in November while attending a high school football game in Pleasantville, New Jersey. He was 10 years old. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Iranian forces fired 22 ballistic missiles at U.S. forces in Iraq early Wednesday in what Iran described as fierce revenge for the U.S. assassination of Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani, who was killed in a U.S. drone strike last Friday at Baghdad airport. The missiles, which were launched from Iran, struck the Ain al-Assad base in Anbar province and a base in Erbil. There were no initial reports of U.S. or Iraqi casualties, and Iran warned the Iraqi government before the attack. Shortly after the attacks, Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif tweeted, quote, "Iran took and concluded proportionate measures in self-defense under Article 51 of UN Charter targeting base from which cowardly armed attack against our citizens and senior officials were launched. We do not seek escalation or war, but will defend ourselves against any aggression," he said. Earlier today, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei called the missile strike a slap in the face of the Americans and called for U.S. troops to leave the Middle East.
They were struck with such a slap last night. That's another matter. Military action like this is not sufficient. What is important is ending the corrupting presence of America in the region.
After the missile strikes, President Trump tweeted, quote, "All is well. Missiles launched from Iran at 2 military bases located in Iraq. Assessment of casualties and damages taking place now. So far, so good. We have the most powerful and well-equipped military anywhere in the world by far. I will be making a statement tomorrow morning," he said. That's today. The Iranian missile strike comes just days after the Iraqi parliament voted to expel all U.S. military forces from Iraq after the U.S. assassinated the Iranian commander. We begin today's show in Tehran, Iran, where we're joined by Mohammad Marandi. He's a professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran, part of the nuclear deal negotiations in 2015. So first, Professor Marandi, if you can respond to what took place last night, early this morning, with Iran attacking 2 Iraqi bases that housed U.S. and Iraqi troops, warning Iraq in advance and killing no one.
Well, I think the most important message that the Iranians were sending to the United States was that we can fire missiles at your bases and you cannot intercept any of them. This was the most important American military base in Iraq. All of the Iranian missiles went through the American defense shield, which surrounds all military bases, especially an air base, and they reached their targets. So I think that is an important message because it means basically that all American bases in the Persian Gulf region are vulnerable. And all those countries, perhaps more importantly, that are hosting American bases are vulnerable to Iranian missiles, and there is no force that can bring them down.
Were you surprised by this attack? And how do you respond to the foreign minister, Javad Zarif, saying we do not seek escalation or war, but will defend ourselves against any aggression?
No, I wasn't surprised. I think most people were expecting an attack at some point during this period. What perhaps surprised me was the fact that the Americans were unable to intercept any of the missiles. I think at this stage, from what we've been hearing from the foreign minister and others, is that Iran does not plan more military strikes. They've caused significant damage to the base. It is possible that the Iranians did not want to have any casualties. We don't know exactly what happened. We'll find out in the coming hours. But what is clear is that the missiles reached their targets, and that the Iranians informed the Iraqis before the attack in order to prevent any aircraft or civilian aircraft that may be flying in the region to be in danger.
Professor Morandi.
And they could have told the Iraqis to inform the Americans. I'm not privy to that sort of information, so it's all speculation for me.
You tweeted, everyone should immediately leave the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and other countries where U.S. bases are seen as a threat to Iran. If the Trump regime makes a foolish move, these regimes will be held responsible, considered hostile entities, attacked with full force and destroyed. Explain.
Well, if the regimes in the United Arab Emirates, for example, and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia allow the United States to use bases to attack Iran, then they will be hostile entities, and Iran will strike back and bring down the regimes. I think it's quite clear. If in war, that's what happens. So what the Iranians and ordinary people should leave the region as soon as possible, because we have no idea what Trump is going to do. He's the sort of person that you have to see what he tweets in the morning when he wakes up. So people who live in the Persian Gulf region, if they can leave, they should leave until it becomes clear if the United States wants to escalate or not. But I think it's quite obvious that if any of these countries cooperate with the United States in attacking Iran, they will be considered an enemy of Iran. They are very small, they're very vulnerable, they're family dictatorships. They only form in the case of the United Arab Emirates, the Emirati population is only a fragment of the total population of the country, which is not very large either. So it would not last long. It would probably last a couple of days, the regime in the United Arab Emirates.
Professor Morandi, you were involved in the nuclear deal negotiations that led to the Iranian nuclear deal, the multi-party Iranian nuclear deal that Trump pulled out of. Can you talk about how that relates to what's happening today? And if there are negotiations going on behind the scenes, the U.S. pulling out of that led to almost all closed channel of negotiation with Iran. So who is the U.S. voice there negotiating with Iran? I mean, is it the Swiss ambassador? We heard the Japanese Prime Minister Abe is involved. What is happening?
Well, there are no private negotiations taking place between Iran and the United States. The United States sometimes sends messages through different channels, as you pointed out. But the Iranians are unwilling to negotiate because they say that we've already negotiated a nuclear deal. The Americans tore that deal, and until they abide by those commitments that they made in the deal, we have nothing to talk about. Because if Iran was to accept negotiating with the Americans again, basically the Iranians would be saying that the Americans can tear up their deals and renegotiate, and that's just not possible because the American government would become more demanding. Every time they don't get what they want, they'll impose new sanctions and they'll tear up the deal or whatever deal they sign. So the Iranians are saying if you want to have any negotiations with us, you have to abide by the commitments that were made during previous negotiations, and then we can go on from there. Otherwise, we cannot negotiate with a government that tears apart agreements and carries out economic warfare.
And what is the response at your university, the University of Tehran, where you are now, and around Iran to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani?
Well, one of the major problems that I have with the media in the United States and in much of Europe is that there's always this tendency to call Iran a regime, which sort of implies it's illegitimate and not stable, and to claim that it is unpopular, it is evil, it is corrupt, and that it is falling apart. And I've been hearing this since I've been a teenager. The fact that it exists and it has existed for decades, I think should have by now made it clear to many in the West that this is a legitimate government with a constitution, with checks and balances, and which has a high degree of legitimacy among the public, whether people in the West like it or not. But the funeral that, or the funerals that we saw, I think shows the degree to which the Islamic Republic of Iran is legitimate in the eyes of the public, because the numbers were extraordinary. But in Tehran alone, between 5 to 7 million people participated in the funeral. It's just unheard of. And even in Iraq, we constantly hear that the Iraqis hate Iran, the Iraqis hate the Popular Mobilization Force, the force that actually defeated ISIS. But when the American government murdered the Iranian general, as well as the Iraqi general, the deputy head of the Popular Mobilization Force, we saw the huge funerals in Iraq, where in each city, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, as the funeral passed through those cities, they carried the Iranian commander on their shoulders with the Iranian flag. So I think a lot of what we hear in the United States and a lot of what we read in the United States and a lot of what we watch on television in the United States is wishful thinking that come from the corridors of power. And because they misread Iran and they present a picture of Iran which they would like to believe, they constantly miscalculate based upon those impressions that are not based on reality.
Very quickly, Professor Morandi, the protests against the Iranian regime that happened before, and there were protests, of course, long protests in Iraq against the Iraqi government. Now there are going to be protests called for January 10th in Iraq against both Iranian and U.S. influence in Iraq. And what has the assassination of Soleimani meant for the anti-government protesters in Iran? It looks like it has brought together people across the political spectrum and led to an ascendancy of the far right in Iran.
Well, I don't understand why you use the term regime for Iran. Do you use it for France or Britain or Canada or Australia? Is it just for Iran? And I don't know what the far right means, because our politics are very different from politics in your country. So in Iran, politics are very fragmented. We have different political parties. If you mean those who are more opposed to U.S. policies in this region, I think actually what Trump has done is he's created a consensus among the political parties and the overwhelming majority of Iranians that the United States government cannot be negotiated with. And protesters against the government are protesters against the government. We have to make a distinction. The protests that were made against the government were against the fuel hike that the government implemented, very poorly managed. And those ended on day one with no arrests and no deaths. Subsequent to that, we had the riots. Those riots were egged on by Persian language media channels funded by Western governments. And many of them were violent and coordinated from outside the country, such as the MEK terrorist organization. They attacked banks, hundreds of banks within 2 days. They burnt over 100 gas stations. They attacked refineries. They attacked storage sites for grain. These are not ordinary riots that we had in Iran. So, again, whether you
how many
like
people
Iran
do you
or not.
How many people do you think were killed in those protests?
I don't know the numbers, but the point that I'm making is that if Iran, if the Islamic Republic of Iran, with the constitution that currently exists, was unpopular, you would not have seen the scenes in Tehran and in the other cities that you saw. I think it's time for Western countries to accept the fact that the people of Iran have their own state and they make their own decisions, and it's not for the United States or the Europeans to determine how Iranians conduct themselves and how the Iranians decide to implement policy and what laws are passed in this land. It's best for the United States and the Europeans to take care of their own affairs. They have enough trouble among themselves and in their own countries right now as it is.
Let me ask you just on that issue of the protesters killed. The U.S.'s special representative for Iran, Brian Hook, said more than 1,000 Iranian citizens may have been killed in that uprising, what you called the riots. Do you think that's possible, Professor Marandi?
No, that's completely nonsense. Those are all the numbers made up by the United States are fabrications. We don't take anything that the American government takes seriously, just like the American government claimed that General Soleimani went to Iraq to carry out attacks on the Americans. We know now from the Iraqi Prime Minister that he went there to see the Iraqi Prime Minister and to discuss a letter from Saudi Arabia, because the Iraqi Prime Minister was trying to mediate between the two countries. And the Iraqi Prime Minister said in Parliament that Trump knew about this and that Trump supported this. But then the Americans went and murdered this general. If this general was not popular, if the Islamic Republic of Iran did not have a high degree of legitimacy, again, I repeat, you would not have seen such crowds. And Iran is an educated society. So one cannot say that they're stupid, that they're backward, that they're fools. No, I think it shows that the narratives on Iran, whether it's about riots, whether it's about oppression, those narratives in the West are not completely accurate.
Mohammad Marandi, I want to thank you for being with us, Professor of English Literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. He was part of the nuclear deal negotiations in 2015, speaking to us from Tehran, Iran. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, well, later in the broadcast, we're going to San Juan to talk about the earthquake in Puerto Rico. But first, we'll go to Juan Cole at the University of Michigan. Stay with us. Dawn 4 still by the Kurdish-Iranian Khan Kalor. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we continue to look at Iran's attack on 2 Iraqi military bases that house U.S. and Iraqi troops, firing 22 missiles at the bases. No casualties reported. Iran described the attack as revenge for the U.S. assassination of Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani at the Baghdad International Airport last week. We go now to the University of Michigan, to Professor Juan Cole, who teaches history there. His blog and forum Comment is online at juancole.com, the author of many books, including Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires. Your response to the Iranian attacks on the Iraqi bases that house U.S. and Iraqi troops, and then, of course, before that, the assassination of Soleimani.
Well, both the assassination of General Soleimani and the Iranian response are unprecedented in the past 40 years of tension between the United States and Iran. In fact, the assassination of General Soleimani is unprecedented in general. I lived through the Cold War, and never do I remember the United States assassinating a Soviet general. The two countries were involved in very serious proxy wars and great tensions, but it never went to the point where they would just murder each other's high officials. So this is, I think, something that would only be done by an extremely erratic person such as Donald Trump. This is not a normal piece of statecraft. And that it would elicit an enormous response from Iran was predictable. The response that came, however, did surprise me because Iran has not tended to act in a direct and open fashion against its enemies. In recent years, it has tended to have a certain degree of deniability in anything that it did. It still hasn't been absolutely determined that Iran itself struck the Abqaiq refinery in Saudi Arabia in September. There have been tanker attacks that, again, haven't been directly tied to Iran, although Iran is under suspicion for them. So I had expected that Iran would work through proxies and try to avoid having a direct fingerprint on this response. That they fired missiles at bases where U.S. personnel were present, even though they appear to have gone out of their way to avoid any casualties, either Iraqi or American, at least symbolically takes this conflict between the two countries to a much higher level. It's spiraling, it's escalating in very worrisome ways.
What do you think will at this point happen? Today, President Trump expected to address the nation.
The two countries at this point have, several choices before them. One would be to leave it at that. There was an assassination. There was a response. The two have been involved in a lot of covert actions against one another. They could go back to doing that. Or it could escalate. President Trump could order missile strikes on facilities of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, in which case I presume there would be an Iranian response to that as well. So the other, these are the two possibilities that are before us, either finding a way to turn to diplomacy and stand down or to escalate.
I wanted to turn to the U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper speaking Tuesday.
As we defend our people and interests, let me reiterate that the United States is not seeking a war with Iran, but we are prepared to finish one. We are seeking a diplomatic solution, but first, this will require Iran to de-escalate. It will require the regime to come to the table with the goal of preventing further bloodshed. And it will require them to cease their malign activities throughout the region. As I've said, we are open to having this discussion with them, but we are just as prepared to deliver a forceful response to defend our interests.
Juan Cole, your response to the U.S. Secretary of Defense.
Well, I just find it very difficult to take this sort of discourse from the Trump administration seriously. They killed one of the high-ranking generals of another country, and then they said they did that to avoid a war, or that now is the time for de-escalation. I mean, what world do they live in? This is extremely erratic behavior, and the fact that someone who's relatively level-headed like Mark Esper is going along with it is extremely alarming. I think that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff should simply have resigned rather than go forward with this attack on Soleimani, which was clearly illegal. The Prime Minister of Iraq, who everybody in the U.S. press and among the political class is completely ignoring. There's a kind of Trump's insistence on a white hierarchy has turned into a white hierarchy of knowledge. So if a brown person says something, it's just not entered into the discourse. Abdul Mahdi made it very clear that he had invited General Soleimani to Iraq to be involved in negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia to reduce tensions. Soleimani came on a commercial flight where the manifest is clear. He checked through Baghdad airport with a diplomatic passport, and then Trump just blew him away along with several other people, including a high-ranking Iraqi military official. This is weird, and one can only imagine that it's possible that Trump and Esper and Pompeo and that gang didn't want tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran to be reduced. And that was the reason for the strike. This cover story they gave up that Soleimani was coming to kill Americans is falling down, laughing ridiculous. And
now they just refer to him as a bad guy.
Now and you see major journalists and television anchors talking about him as a bad guy. This is not journalism. This is just war propaganda.
Let me ask you what Garrett Graff, the journalist, tweeted yesterday. He said, reminder that as this crisis escalates, we have no director of national intelligence, no deputy director, no Homeland Security secretary, no deputy secretary, no head of CBP or ICE, no State Department undersecretary of arms control, no assistant secretary for Europe, and no Navy secretary.
The Trump administration is a hollow shell. 6 high Pentagon officials have recently resigned, partially because of Trump's erratic behavior. It's extremely worrisome that a person with, it seems to me, clear personality deficits is the commander-in-chief of the United States and actually, can launch nuclear weapons. So that he's engaging in this kind of escalation is extremely worrisome. The other thing that the American public is not generally being told, although it sometimes comes out a bit, is that the United States has Iran under a financial blockade of unprecedented proportions. Iran is being sanctioned to a degree that no country has ever been sanctioned in peacetime. In essence, if you drew up a naval blockade to prevent Iran from trading with other countries, that would be an act of war in international law. The Trump administration has done this through financial means. It's gone to Japan, South Korea, India, said you may not deal with Iran. You may not buy Iranian petroleum. So Iran's petroleum receipts have plummeted. That was 70% of their income. From 2.5 million barrels a day to 500,000 barrels a day. The country is being economically strangled, and that is the reason for which we see all of this tension and violence. Trump has been at war with Iran for 19 months.
Can you respond to the contradictory messages from the Pentagon and the White House Monday? The U.S. command in Baghdad issued a memo to the Iraqi government appearing to suggest the U.S. would withdraw U.S. troops from the country. This after the Iraqi parliament's vote to expel U.S. military forces. But hours later, Defense Secretary Mark Esper said the U.S. is not withdrawing with troops from Iraq.
Well, again, it's just typical Trump administration dysfunction. CENTCOM, the Central Command in the Middle East, knows very well that the United States troops have to leave Iraq now. The Parliament voted, it wasn't an advisory vote. The Parliament voted that the Iraqi government should take steps to expel U.S. troops. That resolution that Parliament passed was presented to them by the Prime Minister. It was an act of the executive to have the vote. So the Trump administration is trying to depict it as a mere advisory vote. It wasn't. It was a vote of Parliament, and the executive asked for the vote, and will now. And Prime Minister Abdel Mahdi said that he takes the letter from the U.S. military at its face value, which was that the U.S. was preparing to leave. The United States troops can't be in Iraq if the Iraqi government doesn't authorize their presence, because it would open them to lawsuits. Every time they got involved in a firefight, if somebody was killed, those people could haul U.S. troops before an Iraqi judge. They could be executed for murder. So the U.S. troops will have to leave, and I think the Iranian strikes on those bases were partly to encourage the Sunni Arabs and the Kurds, who are dragging their feet on this matter, to agree that the U.S. troops should leave because they don't want to be in the middle of a crossfire between Iran and the United States.
Well, Juan Cole, I want to thank you for being with us, professor at University of Michigan, speaking to us from Ann Arbor. As we turn now to Ali Kadivar, assistant professor of sociology and international studies at Boston College, grew up in Iran during the Iran-Iraq War, completed his undergraduate and first graduate degree at the University of Tehran, where he was active in the student movement. Your response to the effects of what's happening now, the U.S. assassination of the Iranian commander of Soleimani, now the Iranian attack warning Iraq in advance, no U.S. or Iraqi troop casualties as a result of those attacks. And this all happening after these major anti-government protests, both in Iraq and Iran, what this means for the people of Iran. Professor Kadivar.
I think the hit at General Soleimani was also a hit at Iran's domestic politics, Iran's domestic democratic politics. It can tell us a lot to go on the day before Soleimani was assassinated. So we had this series of protests that happened in December. It was ignited by the hike in petroleum price, but it turned to protests and riots against the Islamic Republic. It's actually very natural to see attacks to banks and buildings when protests are against austerity or when the protests are spontaneous. There is sociological research and research in political science that documents this, in contrast to what the previous guest, Mr. Marandi, said. And the Iranian regime's response was brutal and very violent. Amnesty International says more than 200 people were killed. Other opposition website Kalameh has reported about 400 or 500 people have been killed. What is for sure is that hundreds of people were killed. And this was a big damage to the prestige of the Revolutionary Guards that were involved in the repression of the protesters and the Islamic Republic in general. One day before Soleimani's assassination, the commander of the Revolutionary Guards went to the city of Mahshah in the northwest of Iran. There was a bloody crackdown on protesters in this city. And they were trying to make up for the blood that was shed. They were going to give money to the families of the victim and console their pains. The whole regime was scrambling to explain why the regime had such a violent response. A letter was signed on that day by 100 conservative figures. There have been many letters to Supreme Leader Khamenei or to other officials of the Islamic Republic criticizing the political situation. But what is interesting that this letter was signed by 100 conservative figures. And they warned Mr. Khamenei that with the current approaches that the government has been taking towards Iranian politics, Islamic Republic is in its way of demise. Now General Soleimani's assassination completely changed the narrative in Iran. There is no conversation ongoing about the protest, no conversation ongoing about the violence that the government used in response to protesters. We see in various videos, it's very clear that the security forces opened fire on civilians that were unarmed. This is very visible in various videos that people uploaded to social media. But then you see someone like Mr. Marandi, who's known to be a mouthpiece for the regime, comes out and says this was just a conspiracy of the foreigners. The narrative has changed. General Soleimani was popular inside Iran because not much discussion can happen inside Iran criticizing Iran's foreign policy and involvement in Iraq and Syria. Soleimani was mostly seen as a national figure, as a defender of Iran's national security, as someone that fought with ISIS. So killing of Soleimani was seen as an act of aggression on the entirety of Iran, not necessarily an act against the Islamic Republic. And that's why we see such a crowd coming out in Soleimani's funeral. It really heightened the nationalist sentiments among Iranians. I don't think all these people came out to show support for the regime. They came to show their support for for Iran as a country, but of course, not all that crowd can speak for themselves. So when the crowd goes home, then Iranian officials will come out and claim legitimacy from this big crowd that has been out. This is not anything new in the history of Islamic Republic. Islamic Republic does not allow open and free elections in which the opposition parties can participate. But it's a post-revolutionary regimes. They have had a high capacity in mobilizing their supporters. They can bring their supporters to the street. This funeral was definitely coordinated, but I think all the observers said that this was beyond just some funeral that government orchestrated. Iranians genuinely came out to mourn Soleimani and show their support for the country, but the regime is going to claim this for their regime's legitimacy, which was in trouble because of the violent response to the protests. The conversation has changed. Now criticizing Iran's foreign policy is much harder. Revolutionary Guard has claimed and I think gained more prestige, especially from the attacks they did last night. We hope, all of us hope, that the escalation ends. The Soleimani's assassination was a major act of escalation. Last night was escalation. We were all very worried and concerned that where this is going to go. Iranians do not want to see another war. I was born under Iran-Iraq war. I still remember running away from missiles and going to shelters. We know how destructive a war could be. We have seen this once. Iraq has seen this once. And it's very unfortunate that this confrontation between Iran and the United States is happening in Iraq, and Iraqis are paying the price for it. But the more acts of escalation, the more militarization would embolden hardliners in Iran, would bring security forces such as the Revolutionary Guards to the center of the Iranian politics. Iranian regime, Islam, yeah.
I want to bring in Florida State Representative Anna Eskamani of Orlando. She is the first Iranian American to be elected to any public office in Florida. Representative Eskamani, I want to thank you for being with us. And I was wondering if you can respond to the latest situation that we've been learning about on the border, as details are emerging about how Border Patrol detained and questioned as many as 200 Iranian Americans at the U.S.-Canada border over the weekend. New York Times reporting some of them were detained for hours, including being interrogated about their opinions on the United States and the situation with Iran. Apparently, many had gone to Vancouver for whole families for a Persian pop concert.
Correct. Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. And I also just want to echo the previous speaker's points around nationalism rising in Iran and how there continues to be a demand for a true democratic government in Iran, but a desire not to go to war. And that is a very big difference between what the people of Iran want right now, based on talking to my family. In regards to the border, we saw this happen in action on social media as families began sharing their stories of being stopped and questioned at the border. And the reality is that when we see the potential war rise in countries like Iran between the United States, we'll see xenophobia rise right here locally. And whether it's through different rhetoric on the internet or state-sanctioned questioning from Customs and Border Control, it becomes really, really scary and problematic to be an Iranian American in this country. And I was very pleased to see solidarity coming from other Americans standing side by side, those who have been treated this way, and of course members of Congress stepping up to ensure that answers are found on what exactly took place and that justice is served for those who are seeking it.
You've said that Trump's policies have been catastrophic not just for U.S.-Iran relations, but also for any kind of democratic reform within Iran.
It's been very problematic. I mean, I have opposed President Trump's policies from day one. And whether it was the travel ban, which selectively chose Muslim-majority countries, Iran included, making it much more difficult for Iranians to travel to this country, to attend our universities, to engage in American democracy, whether it was the economic warfare through really extreme sanctions, prohibiting even humanitarian needs going to Iran, all the way to the rise of hate crimes in this country, as we're seeing not just with Iranian Americans, but other groups as well. The reality, too, is that if the Trump administration truly cared about the people of Iran, he wouldn't toss around the idea of attacking cultural sites, which allow the Islamic Republic of Iran to use as propaganda to help build those crowds during these funerals. And so, unfortunately, our president continues to be irresponsible with his rhetoric, lacking complete strategy. And I don't think he and his administration expected this type of reaction from Iran. However, I remain hopeful for de-escalation. It was very scary to watch everything take place last night. But I'm very hopeful that members of Congress will ensure that there is accountability and oversight and that we prevent going to war with Iran.
I want to thank you both for being with us. Florida State Representative Anna Eskamani of Orlando, the first Iranian-American to be elected in the state of Florida, and Ale Kadivar, who is assistant professor at Boston College in Boston, Massachusetts. Also Juan Cole, professor of history at University of Michigan. When we come back, we go to Puerto Rico, where 6.4 magnitude earthquake has rocked the island, sparking a massive power outage. We'll go to that in a second.
¿Dónde está la tierra que el dolor no se puede ni aguantar? Sufro tanto esperando que vengas a buscarme. Ya ni los rezos, ya ni los besos se quieren esperar. ¿Dónde está la tierra que la luna no se quiere ni asomar?
Let's Not Touch the Land by Andrea Cruz. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we turn to Puerto Rico, where President Trump has signed an emergency declaration after a 6.4 magnitude earthquake rocked the island Tuesday morning, killing at least one person, plunging nearly the entire population into darkness and a mass power outage. It's the most powerful earthquake to hit Puerto Rico in more than a century. Hundreds of quakes have rattled Puerto Rico since late December. A 5.8 magnitude quake struck Monday, damaging the coastal town of Guanica. Damage from the earthquakes have left nearly 350 people homeless, at least 300,000 without drinking water. Puerto Rico Governor Wanda Vazquez says power would be restored throughout most of the island within 24 to 48 hours. Schools on the island remain closed Wednesday. The disaster declaration comes as the U.S. continues to hold up federal aid to Puerto Rico for recovery from Hurricane Maria, which devastated the island in 2017, killing at least 3,000 people, although some counts say the death toll is likely much higher. The storm left Puerto Rico in the dark for months and the longest blackout in U.S. history. We go now to San Juan, where we're joined by Yarimar Bonilla, political anthropologist at the City University of New York, co-editor of the anthology Aftershocks of Disaster, Puerto Rico Before and After the Storm. Aftershocks has taken on a new meaning, Yarimar, Professor Bonilla. If you can talk about what has happened now, how much electricity is restored, water, how is the island being taken care of right now?
Well, so an estimated quarter to one-third of the population has electricity back again. This after they were originally told that, the whole island would have electricity back by noon yesterday. So a lot of folks are, frustrated and feeling that this is like an aftershock of Hurricane Maria, or just a repetition of it in terms of government mismanagement, lack of information, problems with infrastructure, and these kind of infrastructural aftershocks that are not just about the earth shaking, but really about a lack of preparedness on the part of the government, and also a deep fragility and vulnerability that was pre-existing because of Hurricane Maria and the debt crisis and everything that placed us in the path of Hurricane Maria being devastating.
What about the emergency response of President Trump? What does this mean for the island? Certainly fiercely criticized for what he did after Maria and the aftermath right through to today.
Yeah, well, we're grateful that he hasn't tweeted anything offensive about us this time. So, small favors. And, it is important that he signed that emergency declaration, although, it's hard to know what that will mean since we're still waiting to receive the funds from the emergency declaration of more than 2 years ago. And that holdup of funds has meant that, roads haven't been repaired, schools that serve as shelters aren't in disarray. There's a lack of infrastructure and preparedness that is still, being attended to from the last, climatic event. So it's unclear when that emergency aid will kick in. Certainly, folks here are not waiting for it.
And can you talk about the response of Governor Wanda Vazquez, certainly a controversial governor, following the ouster of Governor Rosselló? We're going to turn right now to a clip of Wanda Vazquez, the Puerto Rican governor, declaring a state of emergency throughout the island.
I have just signed a declaration of state of emergency. We have declared a state of emergency for all of Puerto Rico. We all felt the earthquake, so we all can benefit from this declaration, and we can make evaluations for our municipalities and our residences, so we can have a clear picture of what the consequences of this earthquake is. At the same time, I have signed a declaration activating the National Guard of Puerto Rico, so the National Guard can assist us in any way necessary. We have to manage the situation calmly. We are all worried, we are all anxious and nervous. It is natural. We are talking about a situation that Puerto Rico had not experienced in the last 102 years.
That is Governor Wanda Vazquez. And I also want to read a clip from Professor Yonamara Bonilla's book, Aftershock of Disaster, where she and co-editor Marisol Lebrun write, quote, "Since Hurricane Maria made landfall, Puerto Ricans have found themselves relentlessly jolted by the storm's aftershocks. This happens every time systemic failures are revealed, death and damages are denied, aid is refused, profiteering is discovered, and officials who were not elected by local residents make drastic decisions about the island's future. Aftershocks remind us that disasters are not singular events, but ongoing processes." We just are going right now back to Yonamara Bonilla. The studio that we were talking to her in San Juan has just lost power. Professor Bonilla, we have you on the telephone. Describe the scene right now.
Yes, what has become a regular occurrence here in Puerto Rico. We lost power and the generator, took a hit. So we're still waiting to get the generator back up.
And what kind of word are you hearing from hospitals? The head of the electric company said most have electricity restored, but this is so incredibly dangerous at a time like this.
Yes, I think the part of what's important to distinguish between now and Hurricane Maria is that it's a little bit more geographically contained, the infrastructural damage. The epicenter is in the southern coast of Puerto Rico. And I know a lot of folks, who have family here are worried about their family members throughout the island. But really, it is mostly in the southern coast where people are sleeping outside, having repeated tremors, etc. In the northern coast and the rest of Puerto Rico, we are feeling some aftershocks of the earthquake, but it's mostly infrastructural issues such as this. And the roads are a little bit better here, so we don't have the problems that we had in Maria of people not being able to get to a hospital and of supplies not being able to get to people. So it's a little bit of a better situation, even though it's nerve-wracking in a different sense.
Well,
because unlike Hurricane Maria, we don't know when.
I thank you so much for you joining us again. The studio just lost power in San Juan as we talk about the aftershock of the earthquake. Yonamara Bonilla of CUNY. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.